In the summer of 1314, a colossal English army marched into Scotland. The stories say it was 20,000 strong, the largest invasion force the country had ever seen, a wave of steel sent to crush the Scottish rebellion once and for all. While modern historians think the number was closer to 13,000, it was still a terrifying force. Waiting for them was a Scottish army of just 6,000 men. Outnumbered, out-equipped, and facing the most feared cavalry in Europe, they should have been annihilated. But their king, Robert the Bruce, had a plan. At the heart of that plan was a revolutionary tactic, a bristling, creeping wall of spears that would turn England's greatest strength into its fatal weakness. This is the story of how a small army, through sheer brilliance and tactical genius, pulled off one of history's most stunning underdog victories at the Battle of Bannockburn. So, how did two kings end up facing each other across a marshy field in central Scotland? It all goes back to the brutal, decades-long struggle for Scottish independence. For years, Scotland had writhed under the thumb of its powerful southern neighbor. The English king, Edward I, the infamous Hammer of the Scots, had systematically dismantled Scottish sovereignty, executing leaders like William Wallace and packing Scottish castles with his own men. But when he died in 1307, his son, Edward II, took the throne. And Edward II wasn't his father. Beset by conflicts with his own barons, he just didn't have his dad's military skill or his single-minded focus on crushing Scotland. This power vacuum was the opening a Scottish nobleman named Robert the Bruce had been waiting for. After having himself crowned King of Scots in 1306, he was quickly defeated and forced into hiding, becoming a fugitive in his own kingdom. Legend has it he was inspired by a spider patiently spinning its web, a symbol of his own stubborn, tireless struggle. Emerging from the shadows in 1307, Bruce launched a masterful campaign of guerrilla warfare. With brilliant commanders like James the Black Douglas and Thomas Randolph by his side, he started taking his kingdom back, piece by piece. He smartly avoided big, pitched battles against the superior English forces. Instead, he relied on raids, ambushes, and scorched earth tactics that slowly wore the English occupiers down. One by one, the castles fell. Perth was taken in 1313, and then Edinburgh in a daring night raid led by Randolph. By 1314, almost all of Scotland was back in Bruce's hands. Only a few strongholds remained, the most important being Stirling Castle. It was strategically vital, controlling the main route into the Highlands and acting as a powerful symbol of English authority. In 1313, Robert's ambitious brother, Edward, laid siege to the castle and made a deal with its English governor. If an English army didn't arrive to relieve the castle by June 24, 1314, the governor would surrender. It was a chivalrous move, but a risky one. Edward Bruce had basically thrown down a challenge that King Edward II of England couldn't possibly ignore. Letting Stirling fall without a fight would shatter his authority and be seen as a quiet admission that Bruce was the true king. So, despite the political chaos at home, Edward II had no choice. He summoned a massive army from England, Wales, and Ireland. It was a glittering host of knights and soldiers, confident they were about to relieve Stirling and finally put an end to Robert the Bruce. The stage was set for a final showdown. As the English army snaked its way north, the sheer difference between the two forces became terrifyingly clear. King Edward II commanded a force of up to 13,000 men. The heart of this army, its hammer blow, was its heavy cavalry. Around 2,000 to 3,000 heavily armored knights, the medieval equivalent of main battle tanks. These knights were backed by a huge body of infantry, including thousands of deadly Welsh longbowmen whose armor-piercing arrows had won battles for England before. This was a state-of-the-art military machine, well-equipped and brimming with arrogance. Waiting for this iron tide was Robert the Bruce, with maybe 6,000 to 7,000 men. His force was almost entirely infantry, spearmen drawn from Scotland's towns and countryside. He had a tiny cavalry force of about 500 light horsemen, but they were scouts and raiders, not shock troops who could take on English knights. On paper, the Scots stood no chance. But Robert the Bruce wasn't a conventional commander, and he didn't plan on fighting a conventional battle. His greatest asset was his intimate knowledge of the Scottish landscape. He knew he could never win on an open plain where the English cavalry could charge freely. He needed an equalizer, and he found it in the terrain just south of Stirling. Bruce chose his ground perfectly. He positioned his army in a woodland called the New Park, where the trees would hide his true numbers. The approaches to his position were a tactical nightmare for an attacking army. The ground was a treacherous mix of bogs, streams, and pools. The biggest obstacle was the Bannockburn, a stream with steep banks that would force any army into a bottleneck. And Bruce didn't just rely on nature. He turned the terrain into a death trap. Along the old Roman road, the most likely path for the English advance, he ordered his men to dig hundreds of concealed pits, or pots. These knee-deep traps were covered with branches and turf, creating a hidden minefield designed to snap the legs of war horses and shatter a cavalry charge. Bruce's strategy was clear. He wouldn't let the English fight the battle they wanted. He would force them onto his ground, a cramped, broken landscape where their numbers would become a liability and their heavy cavalry would be neutralized. He was setting a deadly snare, and the English army was marching right into it. On Sunday, June 23rd, 1314, the vast English army arrived, a forest of colorful banners against the sky. The English vanguard pushed forward, expecting the Scots to run at the mere sight of them. They had two goals: engage the Scots and send a cavalry force to relieve Stirling Castle, which would technically win them the bet. This led to the day's first big clash. A force of several hundred English knights under Sir Robert Clifford skirted the main Scottish position, riding hard toward the castle. But Bruce had seen this coming. He'd tasked his nephew, Thomas Randolph, with guarding this very approach. Seeing the English knights slip past, Bruce famously remarked that a rose had fallen from his chaplet. Stung by the rebuke, Randolph moved his 500 spearmen out of the woods to block the English cavalry. What happened next was a perfect preview of the main event. The English knights saw the lone block of infantry and charged, expecting to ride right over them. Instead, Randolph formed his men into a dense, hedgehog-like formation called a Schiltron, an impenetrable wall of spears. Horses, no matter how well trained, won't charge into a wall of steel. The English charge crashed into the pikes and broke apart. The knights surrounded the Schiltron, hacking away, but they couldn't break the disciplined formation. Eventually, Randolph's men began to push back, and the dispirited English cavalry was forced to withdraw. The Schiltron had been tested, and it had passed with flying colors. At the same time, a moment of pure chivalric drama unfolded. Robert the Bruce himself was riding a small horse, scouting ahead of his lines with only a battle axe for a weapon. An English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, spotted the golden coronet on Bruce's helmet and realized who he was. Seeing a chance for immortal glory, de Bohun lowered his lance and spurred his massive warhorse into a full charge. Bruce's men watched in horror. He was completely outmatched, but instead of fleeing, Bruce held his ground. At the last possible second, he swerved his horse aside. As de Bohun thundered past, Bruce stood in his stirrups and brought his battle axe down with incredible force, splitting the knight's helmet and skull. The morale boost for the Scots was electric. Their army erupted in a deafening roar. The English were shaken, having just watched one of their champions killed so dramatically. Bruce's lord supposedly scolded him for his recklessness, But the king only grumbled that he'd broken the shaft of his favorite axe. Shaken and struggling with the treacherous ground, the English vanguard fell back. The main army, arriving late, made a terrible decision. Instead of camping on the firm high ground, they crammed themselves down onto the marshy floodplain between the Bannockburn and another stream. It was a logistical nightmare. The massive army, with its thousands of horses and supply wagons, was squeezed into a waterlogged swamp with no room to maneuver. As night fell, the English were demoralized, disorganized, and stuck on the worst possible ground. For the Scots, day one had been a miraculous success. That night, the two camps couldn't have been more different. Scottish morale was sky high. In the English camp, it was a night of misery and finger-pointing, with commanders arguing over who would lead the next day. As dawn broke on June 24th, Robert the Bruce made an incredibly bold decision. Medieval military wisdom said that outnumbered infantry should always stay on the defensive. That's what William Wallace had done at Falkirk, where his static Schiltrons held off cavalry but were annihilated by English longbows. Bruce had learned from that mistake. He wouldn't wait for the English to regroup. In a stunning reversal of tactics, he ordered his army to advance. The Scottish army emerged from the woods in 3 large divisions. They knelt briefly in prayer, a sight the English king mistook for a plea for mercy. Then the Schiltrons began to move. It must have been a terrifying sight. This wasn't a wild charge, but a slow, deliberate, and unstoppable advance. Thousands of men moving as one, a solid wall of iron spearheads, a creeping forest of death. The young Earl of Gloucester, perhaps still angry from the previous day's arguments, didn't wait for orders. He led his knights in a hasty, disorganized charge. It was a catastrophe. The English cavalry, with no room to build up speed, crashed uselessly into the wall of pikes. The Lanarcost Chronicle described the sound as a great and horrible crash from rending lances and dying horses. Horses were impaled, and knights were thrown to the ground and killed. Gloucester himself was one of the first to die, a huge blow to English morale. The greatest weapon of the medieval world had been stopped dead. As the English cavalry reeled back in chaos, the Scottish Schiltrons just kept pushing forward. The English infantry was now trapped. Jammed together with their own routed cavalry panicking in their ranks, they had no room to form a battle line. The rear of the massive English army kept pushing forward, not knowing what was happening, compounding the crush. It was then that the English tried to play their last trump card, the longbowmen. A group of archers moved to the flank and started to rain arrows on the Scots, causing casualties. But Robert the Bruce was ready. He gave the order to Sir Robert Keith, who led his 500 light horsemen in a swift, decisive charge that slammed right into the archers' flank. The bowmen, unarmored and unprepared for a cavalry attack, were scattered and ridden down. Their threat was completely neutralized. With their cavalry broken and their archers gone, the battle became a brutal infantry slugfest. And it was a slugfest the Scots were winning. The disciplined Schiltrons pressed on, a moving phalanx against a panicked mob. The space was so tight that the massive English army was effectively fighting with only its front ranks. Its huge numbers were now useless. The English lines were on the verge of collapse, and then came the final psychological blow. From a nearby hill, what looked like a fresh wave of Scots suddenly appeared, waving makeshift banners and crying out. This was the small folk, the army's camp followers and servants. Seeing the tide of battle turn, they had grabbed whatever they could and rushed forward to join the fight. To the terrified English, it looked like a fresh Scottish army arriving to seal their doom. It was the final straw. Panic boiled over into a full-blown rout. The English line didn't just break, it disintegrated. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for their lives, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped by the very terrain Bruce had so carefully chosen. Many were cut down by the pursuing Scots. Countless others drowned as they tried to flee across the Bannockburn, their heavy armor dragging them under. The stream became so choked with bodies that, as one chronicle grimly noted, you could cross it dry-shod on the dead. King Edward II himself was dragged from the chaos by his bodyguards. He fled to Stirling Castle, but the governor, now honor-bound to surrender to Bruce, refused him entry, warning he'd be captured. The King of England was forced into a desperate flight, eventually escaping to England by boat. His panicked retreat was a symbol of the utter totality of the English defeat. Bannockburn wasn't just a victory, it was an annihilation. The great English army was shattered. While Scottish losses were light, thousands of English soldiers were lost, and hundreds of knights and nobles were killed or captured for ransom. The flower of English chivalry had been trampled into the mud of the Bannockburn. The Scots captured a fortune in loot, including the entire English war chest. The battle was the decisive turning point. Although England wouldn't formally recognize Scotland's freedom until the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, 14 years later in 1328, Bannockburn effectively secured it. Edward II's authority was broken, and he was never again able to mount a serious invasion of Scotland. For Scotland, the victory was a nation-defining moment. It solidified Robert the Bruce's position as the undisputed King of Scots and united the country behind him. Bannockburn became a powerful symbol of Scottish resilience and the will to be free. Bruce passed into legend as one of Scotland's greatest heroes, the king who, through tactical genius and sheer nerve, faced down impossible odds and led his people to freedom. The story of how 6,000 men defeated a much larger force is a timeless lesson in how clever leadership and disciplined tactics can overcome almost any obstacle. If you enjoyed this dive into one of history's greatest battles, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more. Let us know in the comments which underdog victory we should cover next.